who will lead us through the results of his research project and present them to us. So, David, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rory. That is very much appreciated. So I will start sharing my PowerPoint presentation, first of all. Can just be a little bit slow on my computer. Yeah, okay, you should be able to see it now in full. Nora, is it okay?
It is.
Okay, great, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very happy to welcome you to this concluding event of a huge amount of work that has been going on for almost 6 years. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Stifter, and I'm Professor of Old and Middle Irish at Maynooth University. And since 2015, I have been directing the project PalaeoHibernicum, or short, CronHib at Maynooth University. I will talk briefly about the history of the project, its aims and goals, and I will then introduce you to the website and its central part, the database Corpus, as well as to some basic concepts that are necessary to understand in order to work with Corpus. After that, my colleagues will guide you through a virtual tour of the database and will demonstrate some of its uses. CronHib was funded by a consolidated grant of the European Research Council as part of the Horizon 2020 Research and Innovation Programme of the European Union. Because of the COVID emergency and thanks to the support of the Irish Higher Education Authority and the Maynooth University Research Development Office, it has been possible to extend the project for an additional 8 months, but it has finally come to a close at the end of this April. Of course, the success of the project depended on a huge number of people without whose support since 2014, really, this work would not have been possible. And I want to use the opportunity of this event today, therefore, to sincerely acknowledge the help, collaboration, and support of many who stood out in this regard. I also apologize right in advance to anybody whose name I may have unintentionally forgotten to include. First of all, I have to mention the fantastic team of the Research Development Office in Maynooth University, in particular, Aoife Shanley, Eilish Lynch, Patrick Boyle, Edward Holden, Petra Stolfova, and Shona Leith, as representatives of many, many more. Then all the colleagues in the Department of Early Irish, in the School of Celtic Studies, and in the Arts and Humanities Research Institute at Maynooth University, as well as colleagues in the faculty and the university who gave me support or advice or practical infrastructure, such as office space. I mention especially Dr. Elizabeth Boyle, who took on the burden of head of department during the time of my project. This is and was greatly appreciated, and she will of course have her own moment of glory a little later this evening. I also thank the School of Celtic Studies at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies for facilitating and helping to organize this event today, and in particular in the persons of its director, Professor Rory O'Higgin, whom you just saw, and its administrator, Eileen Niconahu. The patience of my family has gone unthanked for too long, especially that of my wife, Michaela Stifter, so this is an opportunity to acknowledge their longanimity in the past 6 years. Most of all, of course, my personal thanks have to go out to the fantastic members of the CronHib team over this period. The funding allowed me to attract a superb team of 12 researchers, some of whom are giving this presentation together with me today. Since the team is so large, I will not name all of them separately or highlight their many individual achievements, as this would take up too much time. But I want to draw your attention to the Meet the Team page on our website, where you can find detailed information about every one of them. I want to begin with some very brief statistics of what the team and I have achieved in the past almost 6 years, purely in terms of output. We organized 4 international workshops or small conferences as part of the project, besides being involved in at least half a dozen more. The volume Morphosyntactic Variation in Medieval Celtic Languages, Corpus-based approaches, edited by Elliot Lash, Fang Zheqiu, and myself, is the tangible outcome of these events, as it contains key contributions from the events. The volume is freely available via open access. For our articles and talks, we do not have the final numbers yet. Many more articles have been submitted and are still to appear, and we have a number of further talks lined up, but at the moment we have 27 journal articles, 14 book chapters, and 8 reviews published, and we have delivered 59 talks. One PhD has been finished as part of the project, and another one is in the progress of being completed. You can find out more about our project publications on our website as well, and many of the articles are also linked there. The single most important output of our work, however, will be presented in the coming hour. And this brings me to the main topic of this evening. Although Old Irish is sometimes perceived as a medieval standard language, as if the rules for it had been codified to any degree like the rules for Latin had been centuries earlier, the language was in fact fluid, constantly transforming throughout this period, like any natural language does under normal circumstances. In fact, it is my conviction that any comparison with Latin is very unhelpful, since Latin, and especially standardized Latin, as regulated in grammatical descriptions, is not how a normal language behaves. From late antiquity, Latin was a living linguistic fossil, whereas Irish never got trapped in any particular manifestation, but always had the opportunity to develop organically. However, due to the fact that so little is known about when, where, and by whom the extant medieval Irish literature was written, and because of the circumstances of how the overwhelming part of the literature has been transmitted, the picture that we get of the language and its consecutive stages is extremely blurry and seemingly impenetrable. This is not to say that it is complete chaos. Scholars in the past, and indeed scholars who are among us today, have contributed enormously to elucidating the development of the language. It is usually very clear, for example, whether a specific isolated form shows the conservative or the innovative variant of a variation. The problem is rather that a lot of the relevant information is not easily accessible unless one is one of a handful of experts, and that when the amount of data that needs to be processed, even within a single text, is too huge and complex for representing it in a neat picture, what about the whole body of texts, or the whole medieval Irish literature in its entirety? But how can we bring order into this apparent chaos? How can the information be structured in such a way that the patterns of the linguistic trajectories emerge from the mass of data? To do so requires an enormous effort. And the funding that I got from the ERC allowed me to start with at least some of that required effort. It had been the aim of CronHib from the outset to make progress in refining the methodology for dating early Irish linguistic changes in the areas of phonology, morphology, and syntax. The overarching goals can be summarized like this. First of all, assessing the amount of variation and change in early Irish, creating, secondly, an absolute chronological framework of changes, thirdly, applying this chronological framework to date texts more precisely, and fourthly, developing quantitative and statistical ways of determining probabilities for dates. Some of these goals were deliberately aspirational, and some of them revealed themselves to be aspirational during the cold phase work of research. There is, of course, an element of realism here. Even though an ERC project of the size of CronHib looks huge and the time frame seems long at the outset, resources turn out to be surprisingly tight, and the progress of time is merciless. And so we were not able to go down all the interesting paths or rabbit holes that we would have liked or planned to. For instance, we've not been able to define a perfect chronological framework, but we've come a long way towards such a goal, and we've been able to make first steps towards a statistical methodology that allows us to operate with patched data as is usually found in historical linguistics. However, with the resource that we are presenting to you today with our database Corpus, we give the scholarly community a tool in the hand that will make it possible to focus in on individual strands of developments in the seemingly chaotic texture of Old Irish, and that will allow us to recognize more and more of the underlying structures. This tool will enormously simplify the answering of complex questions about the linguistic development of Old Irish over time. In the following, I will present what is probably the single most important output of our work over the past 5.5 years. If one wants to trace those diachronic, so if one wants to trace those diachronic structures that I just spoke about, it is indispensable to take a quantificational approach, to describe and analyze the patterns in a numerical way, to create statistics of various sorts. But to do so, an annotated corpus of the language is necessary. And this is what we set out to do. We created a database with one specific goal in mind: to illustrate the amount of variation in a morphologically highly complex historical language, such as Early Irish, and to track that variation over time. A traditional corpus with, for instance, POS tagging would not provide all the required information that is necessary to model the complex interplay of phonological and morphological developments. So the CRONIPS team started building the database Corf. The acronym stands for Corpus PalaeoHibernicum, or Corpus of Old Irish. I will introduce you now to some fundamental concepts that underpin Corf. Evidently, for a lexical corpus, for a lexical database or a corpus, texts in the target language are a prerequisite. Fortunately, we did not have to start from zero. We were able to build on important pre-existing published and unpublished work on Early Irish texts up to the 10th century. In particular, Aaron Griffith's Milan glosses database was a conceptual starting point for how to go about, not least regarding the way in which items are analyzed and how the data is structured. Other databases of individual texts that we were able to use, structurally often very similar to Griffith's database, are Bernard Bauer's database of the Christian glosses, Siobhan Barrett's database of the poems of Blathwach, and a number of texts that form part of Elliot Lash's POS and syntactically parsed corpus poemic. The rest of the data was tagged as part of the CRONIP project work. Among the texts that were added to the corpus, I want to mention specifically Fang Chechu's Lexicon of the Annals of Ulster, Elliot Lash's database of the very diverse group of texts called Minor Glosses, and Elliot Lash's and Romanos Spulatovas' Lexicon of the Monastery of Tala. In its current version, Corf features over 70 medieval Irish texts and their entire lexicon, running to over 135,000 tokens. The list of captured texts with basic information about them can be found at the very start of the Corf database. The texts range in size from very large ones like the Milan glosses with over 50,000 entries, or the poems of Blathwach with 6,000 entries, to very short ones, such as stray glosses in some manuscripts from Munich. Given the nature of the sources, the genre that is best represented so far are glosses, no surprise, but the corpus is expandable, and I hope that the balance between the genres will shift in the course of time. So Corf is first and foremost a lexicographic database, that is, an electronic dictionary that includes a central selection of Early Irish texts. This is something that distinguishes it from normal textual or linguistic corpora. However, it also differs from traditional dictionaries. Unlike them, which usually give representative examples of words of forms or usages, in Corf, every single token of every single type in the constituent texts has been recorded, analyzed, and annotated. I want to remark here that as a side result of this work, we have been able to correct numerous errors in pre-existing printed editions. Many of the texts in Corf are, practically speaking, new editions of central texts of Early Irish studies. But it would, of course, be a waste of effort if our lexicographic database shouldn't also function as a more traditional linguistic or textual corpus at the same time. Bernard Bauer has created the software Corfusator. This turns the data into annotated text files, which can be exported and treated like a traditional annotated corpus in 3 different versions, with POS tags, with morphological analysis, or with a combination of both. Each text is further broken down into textual units. At some point, it was decided to call the corresponding table sentences. This was not a particularly clever choice because the units are really quite diverse. Depending on the text, the units can correspond to glosses, to sentences, or to stanzas in the case of poetry. But after we had made that decision, it was very difficult to change the name because of the disproportionate amount of reprogramming this would have involved on the back end of the database. And one thing we've learned from the whole experience never mess with existing code. I will not say more about the textual units because on the one hand, they are rather intuitive anyway, and my colleagues will provide you with much more practical information afterwards. I quickly move on to the most important component of Corf, the morphs. Each sentence or textual unit is made up of a series of minimal parts that together carry the meaning. In Corf, these smallest units of text that can be lexically analyzed and tokenized are called morphs. The term morph is one that we introduced ourselves for a central structural element of our database. It is not in use elsewhere in linguistics with the same meaning, and therefore it warrants a little bit more attention. The use of this idiosyncratic term is driven by practical considerations. Those familiar with Old Irish will know that, especially in the verbal system, but not only there are many meaningful elements that are difficult to lemmatize. From the point of view of Old Irish, they are bound morphemes, but from the point of view of related, standard average European languages, these elements correspond semantically and, what is equally crucial, etymologically, to lexical items, i.e. to words in these languages, and the words, as always, to be understood in inverted commas. I'm thinking, for instance, of conjunctions or object pronouns. In Old Irish, they can only occur as bound morphemes, incorporated into an accentual domain, such as the verbal complex, or cliticized to nouns. Occasionally, they can turn into independent words again over the course of time. For practical reasons and to adequately represent the morphosyntactic structure of Old Irish, it is therefore desirable to have a way of speaking about and of tokenizing such items, which hover somewhat uneasily between the status of mere morphemes and words. Morphs are therefore the smallest morphologically analyzable and semantically irreducible element that we operate with in Corf. A morph can be smaller than a word in the ordinary understanding of the word, but more than a morpheme. From the practical point of view of a lexical database, morphs correspond to the tokens that we analyze and annotate. Because Old Irish is such a morphology-rich and morphophonologically rich language, the tokens, i.e. the morphs, have received a very deep level of annotation. This information is stored in the appropriately named morphology table. For example, verbs are annotated according to over a dozen grammatical and morphological dimensions. This is the unique strength of Corf. Where traditional corpora rely on their size, i.e. on their big data, Corf makes up for this by the depth of annotation. It allows users to make precise queries for very detailed grammatical categories and morphology. Now, every morph is unambiguously associated with one specific headword or lemma. The entirety of all lemmata in Corf is listed in the, lemmata table. This is basically a dictionary list of all recorded lexemes or morphs. I have to point out here explicitly that headwords or lemmata in Corf can often deviate from the form that you will be familiar with from the Dictionary of the Irish Language, EDIL. The reason for this is that we try, as well as we are able to set up an idealized early Old Irish form of roughly the early 8th century, even if such a form is not actually attested. Compared with younger forms, these forms contain the greatest amount of phonological and morphological information, as if in a nutshell. EDIL headwords, on the other hand, often don't do that, for instance, when they follow Middle Irish spelling conventions. In our system, such a reference point is actually needed to measure variation. This is relevant later on for searches in the database in order to assess the amount of deviation from the ideal. This can be done by comparing the morphs as the actual physical emanations of headwords with their Platonic ideals that underpin them, i.e. the lemma or the inflected forms of the lemma. These inflected forms are what we call the expected morph. Each actually attested morph in our corpus is also matched by a corresponding Platonic expected morph. Where the two are identical, it can be inferred that no variation or change has taken place, at least not in phonology or morphology. Where the two diverge, some variation is at play, and the difference between the two forms can often be directly translated into a phonological or morphological change. Now, contrary to that belief quoted earlier that Old Irish was something like a standard language, It has become much clearer through the work in Cronhib just how varied the language was, even during the relative short period from the 7th to the early 10th centuries. Capturing the amount of this variation in our data and formalizing its description is one of the unique features of Corf that sets it apart from other corpora. In particular, through the initiative of Fang Jieqiu, the team have created a list of all types of phonological, morphological, and syntactic variation that we were able to identify in the language for our period. The list consists currently of 250 items. This means 250 different kinds of variation. The full list can be found on the website. This list was not just compiled to take stock of the current knowledge of the diachronic linguistics of Old Irish, but it serves an essential purpose of the project. Each variation is assigned a specific ID. Let me just introduce one example. MO074 is the 74th item of morphological variation. It describes the form which the masculine article takes in a nominative plural. The tag MO074 with the index 1 means that a concrete form in a text shows one of the allomorphs in or ind or int, which is of course the norm in Old Irish. The tag MO74 with the index 2 means that the innovative allomorphs na or inna are used for masculine plurals. The appropriate tags can then be assigned to every occurrence of a masculine nominative plural article in the database. If you're interested in this, there happen to be 213 instances of this article in the database. As could be expected, 201 or 94.4% are of the conservative variant, 12 or 5.6% show the innovative variant. As it happens, these ostensibly innovative forms are not just random Middle Irishisms, but there is a very clear morphosyntactic pattern behind them, but that's a story for another time. And this result can be gotten almost by the pressing of a button through the search interface of Corf, which was developed by our programmer Godstime Osadobo. The opportunities that our deep level of annotation affords will mean a major leap forward for the study of variation in Old Irish. In this way, Corf will greatly facilitate the investigation into the amount and extent of variation. With the appropriate queries in the search interface, it will be possible to get comprehensive information about the language at a granularity that was unimaginable before, and my colleagues will demonstrate more of this in a few minutes. Operating with these variational tags makes the tracking of variation very easy. We have already begun with applying variational annotation to the data in Corf, but due to the time constraints and because of the impact of the pandemic, we have not been able to implement this fully yet. Also, we are certain that more than our current 250 types of variation will be identified in future research. With this, I come to the short, mid, and long-term outlook for Corf beyond Chronologicon Hibernicum, since the project is history already now. Corf, first of all, is free to use for everybody. You can just go to the website, browse through the data, or conduct your searches without having to do anything else. It is only for people who wish to edit existing data or who want to contribute more material that it will be necessary to register. I just want to sound one note of warning. Setting up queries in the search interface is not exactly baby simple. Because of the amount and complexity of the data, it requires a certain level of familiarity with the structure of the database to get the results that one is looking for. We provide guidelines for this, currently in a very slim version, but a fuller, much more detailed manual is in the development. And one final word about doing searches. When you have done one and are going to use the search results in your own published research, we kindly ask you to acknowledge the work of the many people who have brought this to you by properly citing Corf. At the bottom of the page, you will find the accurate format of the database page. You will find the accurate format of how to cite Corf and how to cite the involved researchers in your publications. There's also a button at the top that copies the correct citation into your clipboard so that you can then simply paste it into your own documents. Corf is an open database. That's what I wanted to show you. So here you can see the correct citation form, and you actually see that on the website. Corf is an open database, open in a number of respects. It is created in such a way that it's also open for syntactic and more variational annotation than we've included so far. And this will bring additional layers of complexity to how the data is tagged in the database. Corf is also open-ended. It is my hope that further funding in the future will allow me or my fantastic chronic team to add more texts and functions, or indeed, any scholar in the field is invited to contribute. There's a wide range of possibilities for such contributions. For instance, more texts or new layers of annotation could be added as part of PhD thesis. If somebody intends to study specific types of variation, adding the appropriate variation tags is a not too laborious type of contribution. Annotations and texts can be added by anybody, as long as they follow, obviously, the guidelines for data entry. If anybody is interested in doing so, please get in touch with me. It's not possible to give you a full picture of the potential of Corf just in a single information session like this evening. And we are considering organizing workshops for hands-on practice in the future, where people who are interested can become more familiar with functionalities of Corf. Corf is not a perfect resource, and we are well aware of all the construction that is still ongoing at this very moment. It is certainly a prototype in its current incarnation, which will require a lot of further attention and rethinking in the future. In order to improve its functionality and user-friendliness, we also rely on your feedback and your input as users. So please be patient if you're confronted with any bugs in the site. Just report them. This will help us greatly in improving the site. This now is Corf version 1.0, and it is our intention that future updates will occur on a regular basis and will be versionized. Developing the database further is a long-term undertaking. Obviously, this needs funding. Our presentation today is therefore also meant as a demonstration to future reviewers what this resource is about, what it can perform now, and where it is heading. Some of you present in the audience today may well find yourselves in a situation in the future where you will have to evaluate a proposal that has to do, in one way or the other, with Corf. I hope our presentation today is able to highlight some of the potential of the database. So with this, I come to the end of my presentation. Colleagues from the project will now give you a quick tour of what Corf looks like and will demonstrate its core functionalities. In order to avoid any unpleasant surprises during the live demonstration of the database, the following part has been pre-recorded and will be shown as a video. I just want to finish by reminding you that if you have any questions to me or my colleagues, you can put those questions in the chat, and please put an asterisk at the beginning if your comments are meant as questions.